Okay. All right. This week, Sedra, Parshas Beshalach, and of course, in Parshas Beshalach, we read about Kriyas Yamsuf, how the Jewish people, after leaving Egypt, Paro has a change of heart, and he decides to run after the Jews, and the Jews are caught between the soldiers, the horses, the chariots of Egypt, and with the sea, with the Yam. And then miraculously, the sea splits, and the Jewish people go through the dry land that came as a result of the splitting of the sea. And of course, the Egyptian army continues to chase after the Jewish people, and ultimately the waters of the sea that had become like walls liquefy again and drown the Egyptian soldiers, the army of Paro, the oppressor of the Jewish people. And the Jewish people, of course, were saved, and they sing Does Yoshir as a song of thanks and praise to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And they reached this special level that they were able to say, this is my God. They felt a certain closeness to God. But almost immediately after they go away from the Yam, when they leave and they go further on their journey in the desert. So the Torah tells us that they went to Midbar Shore. They went 3 days in the desert. Below Matzu Mayim, they didn't find any water. By Yavo Marasa, they came to the spot in the desert that was called Mara. Bitterness. They weren't able to drink the water of Mara because it was bitter. There is a medrash. Kimarim Haim is, of course, the simple explanation is the waters were bitter. They weren't able to drink it. But there's a medrash says Kimarim Haim. The Jewish people were not happy with the waters of Mara because they were bitter. In other words, it didn't live after seeing Kriyas Yamsuf. Whatever they experienced in Mara didn't live up to their expectations. And by Yilonuham, Moshe, the people complained against Moshe, and then there was the Moshe threw a tree, a branch, whatever it was, into the water, and the water became sweet, and the people were able to drink the water. And Moshe told them, if you listen to the words of God, then you'll do what's proper in his eyes, and you will follow his commandments. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu assures that he will take care of them, and they will not suffer any of the diseases of Egypt. Now, the Gemara at Bava Kama mentions that this is Gemara Daf Pei Beis 82a1, as they call it in the Art Scroll Gemaras. So the Gemara says about this, mentions that Ezra instituted 10 decrees. And one of the decrees that he instituted, that they should read the Torah on the Monday, on Thursday, and on Shabbos. And it's Monday and Thursday, but I mean certainly together with Shabbos. And so Gemara asked the question: was it Ezra who instituted this? Ezra was at the end of the generations of the Nevi'im, of the prophets. He was from the last prophets of the Jewish people. He is the one that led the Jewish people at the beginning of the Second Commonwealth in the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash. And he was the spiritual leader, the Kohen Gadol also, of the Jewish people in the early part of the Second Era. But so it would seem that the instituting to read the Torah on Monday and Thursday was first instituted at the time of Ezra, at the beginning of the Second Commonwealth. But we learn, the Gemara says in the pasuk here, "Vayelchu shlosha yamim," they went 3 days by Midbar in the desert, below Motzu Mayim, and they didn't find water. Dorshe Rishumo Samru, the expounders of verses, they explained it, Ein Mayim el Torah. Obviously, this is from a medrash standpoint, that below Motzu Mayim. So what does Mayim mean? They went 3 days in the desert without water. It means, because in a medrash perspective, the word Mayim, based on Psukim and the prophets, Mayim is identified with Torah. So below Motzu Mayim, that means they went 3 days without Torah. So Nilu. So they became exhausted, spiritually exhausted. Amdu Nevi'im shebenehem. So the prophets among them instituted sheyukorim b'Shabbos umafsikin. They instituted to read the Torah on Shabbos, on Monday, and on Thursday. They instituted the reading of the Torah 3 times during the week. So why? In order that there shouldn't be a repeat of this situation, that they shouldn't go for 3 days without Torah. By instituting that the Torah is going to be read Monday, Thursday, Shabbos, or Shabbos, Monday, Thursday. So by instituting that decree, they were preventing this episode from happening again. So we see that it wasn't Ezra who instituted the reading of Kriyas Torah. It was the Nevi'im shebenehem, the prophets who were among the Jewish people, seemingly at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. when the Jewish people were moving away from the Yam Suf, traveling through the desert, away from the slavery of Egypt. So the Gemara answers that originally, when Moshe Rabbeinu instituted it, Moshe Rabbeinu only instituted that there should be 3 psukim read. But Ezra came and he increased the amount of psukim that should be read. He increased it that the kriyas on Monday, Thursday, and Shabbos should be at least 10 psukim, at least 10 psukim. And then the Gemara discusses why 10 psukim. Okay, but he instituted it should be 10 psukim. So Moshe Rabbeinu and the prophets of his generation, and the Gemara in Bava Kama doesn't say Moshe Rabbeinu, it says the Neviim shebeneim, the prophets among them, but certainly Moshe Rabbeinu was among the prophets. He was the leader of the prophets. So they instituted that it was only necessary to read 3 psukim. But Ezra came and instituted that the minimum amount of psukim should be 10. Obviously, Shabbos we read a lot more than that. Now, and what was the purpose of this? Because the Jewish people were nilu. They became exhausted. And we have to understand, what does it mean they became exhausted? Now, it's interesting. There is a commentary on the Rambam. It's printed in the Frankel Rambam. Most editions of the Rambam do not have that commentary. The Sefer HaMenucha. And the Sefer HaMenucha, when he discusses this takana that was instituted by the prophets in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, so he mentions the Gemara in Bava Kama that it was because of what happened in Morah. But he also mentions other psukim, because in regarding Morah, it's not mentioned that there is no reference to Kriyas HaTorah. It mentioned that they went 3 days, and the Dorshe Rishimo said it means without water, it means that they went 3 days without Torah. And then afterwards we say that Moshe tells the Jewish people that if you want things to go well, if you don't want to suffer, so you should listen to the mitzvos, to the voice of God, to the commandments that he gives. But he wants to suggest something that perhaps he considered a little bit more explicit. And that's at the end of this week's Sedra. It says, just before Amalek attacks the Jewish people, so it says that the Jewish people came to Rephidim. And when they were in Rephidim, they also the Ein Mayim Lishtos Ha'am. They didn't have any water to drink. And because they didn't have water to drink, they contended with Moshe. It was sort of a rebellion against Moshe. They screamed to Moshe, give us water. And then that Moshe, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe to hit the rock, and water came out. Water came out from the rock, and then Amalek attacks the Jewish people. And the Amalek attacks the Jewish people, and the Torah tells us after the Jewish people fight against Amalek. So the Torah tells us that Moshe was told to write about the attack of Amalek. Sov zo sikaron b'sefer. Write this as a remembrance in the Sefer. So it talks about writing about the event of Amalek in the Sefer Torah. So here there is a remez, according to the Sefer HaMenucha, that the reaction here too, what was the cause of the rebellion of the Jewish people? That there was no water. They didn't have water. And the response of the Torah, after mentioning what happened as a result of the way they acted with Amalek attacking them, so sikaron b'sefer, that writing in the Sefer to be read is a reaction, was a necessary reaction to the idea, to the Jewish people rebelling against God, and specifically in the case where they didn't have water. And again, he applies not having water, not just physical water, but not having the spiritual water of the Torah. So this is now the question is, why does the Sefer HaMenucha identify this with what happened in Mara also? But the Torah, in telling us in Parshas Dvarim about the attack of Amalek, this is what I think. It says, "Va'ata aye v'yageya v'lo yarei Elokim." You were tired and worn out. Tired. That is to be identified with exhaustion. And regarding the Gemara, the Gemara tells us that the people were exhausted, spiritual exhaustion. And I think to a certain degree, the spiritual exhaustion and the ayef yageya, tired and worn out, is really what we call depression. A person who is depressed very often is in a state of exhaustion, of tiredness. But coupled with that tiredness, coupled with that state of exhaustion, coupled with that depression, and associated with it is a sense of anger. Anger and depression tend to go together. Sometimes the depression manifests itself in anger, and sometimes the anger manifests itself in depression. And sometimes it goes both ways. And it seems, and that's why Mora is bitterness. Bitterness is associated with anger. Exhaustion, tiredness, depression, bitterness, and anger all go together. And when the Jewish people go for an extended period of time without Torah, and that leads them to rebellion that emanates from depression, from anger, and manifests itself in this manner. So the Ksov Sikaron B'Sefer, we have to use the Sefer Torah and to read from the Sefer Torah to prevent. And my uncle points out that the Sefer Torah, certainly in the first Beis Hamikdash, in the first time, during the time of the first Commonwealth, and prior to that, when they went through the desert, and even when they entered Eretz Yisrael, before the Beis Hamikdash was built, it wasn't just the reading of the Torah, but it was the experience of the Torah. The Torah was like the water, the spiritual water that quenched their thirst, that gave them the feeling of being close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and prevented them from saying, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu Mayim, is God in our midst or not? So this is the this so the so the Ezra. So Moshe Rabbeinu and the prophets in the time of Moshe instituted the Torah, not for learning purposes, but not just for learning purposes. And my uncle seems to think that it was primarily during the first Commonwealth, and before that, it was for experiential purposes, to experience the closeness to God. How does one feel close to God? A number of methods are mentioned among our sages for it, but one of the histakel b'toraso, you can search for God when you look in the Torah. So the takana of reading the Torah was instituted primarily for that experience. Ezra instituted it, my uncle said, for the purpose of learning also. Okay, but whatever the case is, Moshe Rabbeinu and the Nevi'im and the prophets of his generation instituted the reading of the Torah, not going 3 days without reading the Torah, in order to prevent the Jewish people from being spiritually exhausted and sinking into a spiritual depression. And the Rambam, in mentioning this halacha, he mentions that Moshe Rabbeinu instituted. And the truth of the matter is that the Yerushalmi also says that the original takana, the original decree, was made by Moshe Rabbeinu. Whereas the Gemara in the Bavli, the Gemara in Bava Kama, doesn't say Moshe Rabbeinu instituted it. It says the Nevi'im shebenehem, the prophets among them. Undoubtedly, Moshe Rabbeinu was among the Nevi'im. He was the Adon HaNevi'im. He was the master, the spiritual father of all the prophets, both those that were before him and after him. And so why is it, if Moshe Rabbeinu was involved, if Moshe Rabbeinu made the decree, as the Rambam and Yerushalmi say, so why does the Gemara in Bava Kama say the Nevi'im shebenehem, the prophets among them, instituted it? After all, it should say Moshe Rabbeinu instituted it. What does the prophets among them add to the takana of Moshe Rabbeinu, to that which Moshe Rabbeinu instituted? And that question, I think my uncle asked in one of his shiurim. I'm going to suggest, I think, a different approach than my uncle used. But there's another question that my uncle asked. And that is that Moshe Rabbeinu the takon of Moshe Rabbeinu, or the prophets of his generation, to read the Torah was the laning only has to be of 3 psukim. 3 psukim. Ezra then instituted 10 psukim. From the Rambam, it appears, I don't want to spend time to go through the words of the Rambam, but from the Rambam, it appears that, let's say, someone, for some reason, could not have a laning of 10 psukim. He can only read 5 psukim or 6 psukim. Today, after Ezra instituted 10 psukim, he would not be able to fulfill even the mitzvah of Moshe Rabbeinu. After all, we could say, yes, there was a special need. After all, the Jewish people were returning from Bavel. They were part of a society, of a different society, a foreign society. And because of the events that took place, it became necessary to make some differences in the takana, in the expectations of the Jews in regard to reading the Torah. And this was symbolized by saying that the minimum amount of psukim necessary to fulfill the mitzvah could no longer just be 10. It could no longer just be 3, excuse me. Could be 3, but you need actually 10. 10 psukim. But let's say a situation arises where you can only read 6 psukim. Should I read the Torah to fulfill at least the decree of Moshe Rabbeinu? I can't fulfill, for whatever reason, I'm not able to fulfill the takana, the decree of Ezra, the requirement to read 10 psukim. But should I at least try to read the 6 psukim that I'm able to read in order to fulfill the takana, to fulfill the decree of Moshe Rabbeinu and the prophets of his time, of reading 3 psukim, of reading 3 verses? And from the Rambam it appears no. That once the Ezra instituted 10 psukim, you do not fulfill the mitzvah of Kriyas Torah, of 3 psukim. It would seem that Ezra not only instituted a new requirement of 10 psukim, but somehow he removed the mitzvah that was instituted by Moshe Rabbeinu. And the question arises, how could Ezra? Ezra was great, but how could he? And there are certain things that they compare him in a certain fashion to Moshe Rabbeinu. But, of course, Lo Kam Yisrael Moshe. That never arose among the Jewish people like Moshe Rabbeinu. How could Ezra? We can understand Ezra could institute another takon, another decree that demands more than Moshe Rabbeinu demanded. And it could be in the time of Ezra, there was reason to do it. But how could he undo the takana, the decree of Moshe Rabbeinu? One Bezdin cannot negate what a previous Bezdin, what a previous court enacted, unless it's greater b'chachma, with wisdom and in number. Certainly, there was no one as great as Moshe Rabbeinu in wisdom. So how is it possible that Ezra should undo and negate the takon of Moshe Rabbeinu? We can understand adding to it, but saying that you do not fulfill the mitzvah if you do less than he required. You don't have any mitzvah of Kriyas Torah. How could he do it when Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who enacted it? And I think the Gemara in Megillah tells us that Sofrim, the seers, that's an expression for the prophets, instituted what letters, let's say, mem. When mem is in the middle of the word, it's in one fashion, and when it's at the end of a word, it's in another fashion. In our days, we used to say a mem sofit, with an enclosed mem, or schloss mem, in some of the chadarim they would say, is at the end of the word. And there is a mem in a different fashion in the middle of the word. And the Gemara says the Jewish people had forgotten which mem goes at the beginning of the word and which mem goes at the end of the word. And the prophets instituted, the the schloss mem, the sealed mem, goes at the end of a word and the other mem in the middle of the word. And we have the same idea with tzaddik. You have two forms of tzaddik, one that's used in the middle and one that's used at the end. And so the question is, so the Gemara says that the Nevi'im instituted it, but it doesn't seem that they instituted it, but they let the Jewish people know which letter is at that point. And who instituted it says the Nevi'im, the Nevi'e Hadoros, Rashi says, it was the prophets of the generations. The question is, what do you mean it was the prophets of the generations? It was the prophet at that time when they didn't know. That was probably in the time of Ezra. Ezra was the last of the prophets. And at that time, the script, the halachic script of the Torah was changed. Originally, the script, if you look at the archaeology, the script that was used in the time of the first temple, in the time of the first Commonwealth, was called Ksav Livnoi. It was an altogether different Hebrew script. But in the second temple, Ksav Ashuris was used. So because in the first temple there was a different script, the Jewish people didn't know which letters, which form of the mem goes in the middle of the letter word and which form of the mem goes at the end. Because in Ksav Livnoi, in the old script, there was only one type of mem. There was only one type of tzaddik. There was only one type of pay. But in the new script, there were three types. There were two types, excuse me. There were two types. And the people didn't know, because they were not used to the new script. So what is obvious? So in Ezra is the one who changed the script. He decreed that the old script will no longer be valid, and only the new script will be valid. And it seems that at Mount Sinai, both scripts were given. But for whatever reason, there's a discussion in the Gemara. During the first Commonwealth, from the time of Matan Torah, the script of Livnoi was the predominant script used for ritual matters, and certainly for secular matters. And in the second Commonwealth, the Ksav Ashuris, the block letters that we have, that's what was used. And Ezra was the one. So why did it have to say Nevi'ah Hadoros, the prophets of the generations? It was the prophet of a certain generation that told the Jewish people. Why did it say the Nevi'ah Hadoros? But I mentioned both scripts. The Ritva points it out, and the Radvaz also is very clear about it, that both scripts were given at Sinai. But one script was used in the first Commonwealth, and the other script was used in the second Commonwealth. But the script that was not used in the first Commonwealth, the Ksavashuris, the script that we use today, the block letters that we use today, the way the Sefer Torah is written today, those led that form of the alphabet, of the Aleph base, of the letters of the Aleph base, that form was transmitted from generation to generation, not to the masses of the Jewish people. The masses only use Ksav Livnoi, but from generation to generation, from Navi, from prophet of one generation to the prophet of the other generation. And it was the prophet who would decide Al Piruach HaKodesh when would be the time to change the script. So there were certain halachas that were given over at Sinai that with the understanding that the way it's to be done will change eventually. We have other cases of like that. There were times, well, so the days when the Megillah could be read, changes took place. There were situations where people could read the Megillah, certain people could read the Megillah on Monday and Thursday before Purim, where there was a special hardship involved in reading the Megillah on Purim itself. But all that came to an end. Why? From the Rambam in the Perish HaMishnah, it seems that this was given over to the rabbis. The rabbis means the Chachmei HaMasorah. The rabbis who were the spiritual leaders of the generation until the time of the completion of the Talmud. And they were to decide, it seems from the Rambam and Perish HaMishnah, whether these extra days for reading the Megillah were warranted or not warranted. Sometimes regarding certain takanos, certain decrees, the Chachamim, they understood that changing conditions will take place. And because of that, it became part of the Masorah, part of the heritage. There were certain people appointed. It could be either the Chachmei HaMasorah, the rabbinic leaders who were in charge of giving over the Torah from one generation to the other, or the prophets of one generation giving over to the prophets of the next generation. And they were to determine what the necessity of the times would be. And that was instituted in regard to certain decrees, not in regard to all the decrees. In fact, I would suggest that it wasn't instituted in regard to most of the decrees. But there were certain decrees that they were originally made. The Chachamim understood there might be a need for certain changes. And they might have even decreed in the original takana what those changes would be when it became necessary. But it couldn't be decided by a committee. It couldn't be decided by a rabbinic committee, even by a rabbinic committee. And certainly not by a ritual committee. It was only the Chachamim who were given over the responsibility of giving over the Torah from generation to generation. And that special halachic status came to an end, according to the Rambam, with the completion of Talmud Bavli, when Talmud Bavli was completed. And there were things that were probably given over to the prophets, the nature of the script of the Torah. And one prophet, the prophet wasn't just an independent person who received messages from God for his generation. The prophet was a link between the prophet of the previous generation and the prophet of the next generation. And certain things were given over to the prophets to give over from generation to generation. And they knew, they were given instructions when to make certain changes, when the situation demanded that those changes be made. But only they were able to do it. It couldn't be done by anybody else. And I think that that was the case with Kriyas HaTorah also. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu instituted Kriyas HaTorah, 3 psukim. In his time, that was all that was necessary. This was the generation that could learn from Moshe Rabbeinu. The need of Kriyas HaTorah, Moshe Rabbeinu would be talking to them. When they read they didn't need the Torah as much to hear what Moshe Rabbeinu told them, as we who do not hear it personally from Moshe Rabbeinu. We have a greater need. So, but Moshe Rabbeinu, in his wisdom, and probably through Ruach HaKodesh, understood that it will happen, there will be times when there will have to be an increase in the number of psukim, in the number of verses that are read at each time, especially in Bayis Sheni, when Jews were spread over different parts of the world. They weren't all together. They didn't all get instructions from the same person or the same school. So Moshe Rabbeinu said, don't see this takana, don't see this decree that I'm making as something that has to remain the way it is. If a necessity arises to increase the amount of psukim that are read, it can be that my decree can be changed. Because don't view it as my decree. Here I am acting as one of the prophets. And the age of the prophets was not limited to Moshe Rabbeinu's time. It went throughout the whole first period, through the desert, through prior to the building of the Beis Hamikdash in Eretz Yisrael, during the building of the Beis Hamikdash in Eretz Yisrael, even while they were in Babylonian exile. But when they returned, in the time of the Second Commonwealth, there was a realization, the prophets realized there was a need for a change. That's why The Gemara doesn't say Moshe Rabbeinu. It says Nevi'im Shed B'neihem. Moshe Rabbeinu there acted as one of the prophets of the generations. Because when he instituted the mitzvah of reading the Torah 3 times during the week, he instituted with the understanding that the way that Kriyas Torah will take place throughout the generations should be dependent upon the prophets of the generations. And Ezra, being from the last of the generations of the prophets, made certain changes on the basis of his being one of the prophets of the generations. And I think that it's worthwhile to understand why it has to be this way. And the fact that this is so close to the Exodus from Egypt, it seems almost like they're rebelling against Moshe. That necessitated the institution of reading the Torah 3 times a week is somewhat associated with the Shibud Mitzrayim, with their bondage in Egypt. We have to understand, what was the purpose of the Jewish people going down to Egypt? I've mentioned that Egypt is the blueprint for future generations. I've mentioned B'chol dor v'dor, we say on Pesach, B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleil chaoseinu, in every generation. They rise against us to destroy us. And I asked the question, I think it was the last year, why did it say B'chol dor v'dor, in every generation and every generation? It should just say B'chol dor, in every generation. Why twice repeat the word generation and generation? But we confront different problems. Every generation is different. And we confront different problems in each generation. Sometimes those who are oppressors of the Jews, or try to oppress the Jews, that try to destroy the Jewish nation, are politically conservatives. And they claim that the Jews are communists. And sometimes it's communists that complain that the Jews are conservatives. And there are tendencies, sociological tendencies, in each generation that are different. Look, and these tendencies are changing quicker and quicker. The Torah chas v'sholom never changes. Torah can never change. But sometimes we have to adapt. Not the Torah chas v'sholom. Kivu itim la Torah. We have to make the Shimshon Raphael Hirsch would say we have to set the times with the Torah, not the Torah with the times. But the way we give over the Torah varies from generation to generation. And in our generation, it doesn't just vary from generation to generation. In our time, it varies from place to place, from individual to individual. The way we give over Torah to one community will be unsuccessful if we give it over to another community. The Torah itself has to be the same Torah. The practices have to be the same practices. But the nature of the transmission has to change. And this is the lesson, I think. That's why it was the realization. It was this realization that when Moshe Rabbeinu instituted it, he didn't institute it just on the basis of what was necessary for his generation, but he instituted it as something that the prophets of all the generations will play a role. They will evaluate. Of course, we do not have the authority to change the takana, to change the decree. But when it comes to the manner of transmission of Torah to people, one has to know his generation. He has to know his community. He has to know not just the community, but the individuals in the community as well. And the truth of the matter is, this is part of the whole lesson. What was it? My uncle once asked a question about what was it that Yosef's brothers led them to feel so threatened by Yosef? What was it in Yosef's dreams? And my uncle mentioned in one of the two dreams, Yosef says, we're in the field, and we're binding sheaves of wheat. And my bundle of wheat stands up strong, and yours bow down to mine. And of course, the simple reading of the Torah is that the message of Yosef was, listen, I'm going to rule over you. But my uncle says there was another meaning in it. He was going to say things are changing. We have been farmers. We lived in Canaan, a land, we were shepherds. Yes, every once in a while, the Jewish people planted also, Yitzchak planted. But for the most part, the Jews were shepherds. They went from place to place in Eretz Yisrael, but they stayed in Eretz Yisrael. And Yosef is coming and telling them things are going to change. We're going to go into a land, not a land of shepherds. Egypt, for the most part, was not a land of shepherds. They worshiped the cattle. It was a land of farming. And we're going to be working in the fields. We're going to become farmers. And we have to prepare ourselves for it. We have to prepare ourselves for changing circumstances. And the brothers felt, no, we have security the way things were, the way they will continue to be. They couldn't deal with the idea things are going to change. But things do change. And as we go further and further in history, events, the world, the tendencies of the generations change quicker and quicker and quicker. The lesson of Egypt was we have to be prepared for different circumstances. Most of the ancient nations crumbled because the circumstances changed. When they encountered exile, when they encountered slavery, when they encountered bondage, they crumbled as a nation. But the Jewish people alone survived because in their very foundation as a nation, they encounters these difficult circumstances. This was part of the reason of Sheba Mitzrayim, of the bondage in Egypt. El Esav Nasati is Harseil Ereshes also. Esav sets up his nation right away in Mount Seir, because Esav does not have an eternal nation. But the Jewish people were meant to be an eternal nation. And to be an eternal nation, we have to be ready for changing circumstances. Yes, we want to go to communities that we feel spiritually secure. But we don't know that it will remain that way. And we don't know. We might be forced to go to different communities, different areas. And unless we train ourselves for those communities, then unfortunately, we will encounter circumstances that might lead some of our brothers and sisters to give up their commitment to the Masorah. The world changes. This was the mistake, and this is so, of course, while it's true on a spiritual level, it's true on a physical level also. What was the mistake that was made during World War II? There was an assumption, and prior to World War II, there was an assumption. We had pogroms for 1,000 years, and we survived those pogroms. Yes, we are encountering trouble, but just like we survived 1,000 years, our communities will eventually be able to survive this also, until it was too late to realize the mistake that we made. And what is unfortunate is, as time passes from the Holocaust, we're beginning to make that same mistake again. We have to know that time is changing. There are different situations. I read that a certain Rosh Yeshiva gave a speech, and he listed the statistics of yeshiva boys who go into the army, whether it was the Haredim that go into the army, or the Dati Leumi that go into the army, or whoever, of those who gave up observance. First of all, personally, I think that many of those who gave up observance, it's not because they went into the army to give up observance. That because of the army they gave up observance. I think many of them wanted to give up observance anyway. It's just that the army offered them the opportunity to do it. If they had gone out, and they certainly would have, into the outside world, getting a job, and if they weren't prepared for the outside world, eventually the same thing would have happened. If after being so many years in yeshiva, sitting and learning, such a large percentage give up observance because of the environment of the army, then it's not just, we shouldn't look at the army as being the source of the problem. Perhaps part of the problem is that the yeshiva did not train them for changing circumstances. It gave them the impression that only within the four walls of the yeshiva world they would be able to remain loyal to the Torah. I'm not talking now whether yeshiva boys should be drafted or not drafted. That's not the purpose. My point is, it's not a question of the army. It's a question of changing circumstances. And there was a time when Jewish education was not on the level that it is today. But it was superior in training people for changing circumstances, because there was a realization. And today we fraud ourselves into believing that we can manipulate the circumstances where we and our children and our children's children are going to live. The mitzvah of Haggadah is to our children and our children's children, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu helps us out, that we can receive help from HaKadosh Baruch Hu in changing circumstances also. That's part of mitzvah. The Rambam says the mitzvah of Zikaron Yetzias Mitzrayim is to undergo, to know that even when we go into Egypt, we have to know about the slavery of Egypt, not just about the freedom of Egypt. We have to know about the idea of changing circumstances, because Egypt and Yetzias Mitzrayim is the blueprint of the future of the Jewish people. We have to use Yetzias Mitzrayim and Shibud Mitzrayim as a guide for the future. We can't assume that everything is going to remain the same. It never remains the same, and it's changing now faster than ever before. And yes, we always try to live in the strongest community. We always try to be involved as much as we can in Torah learning, in the Torah community. But we can't assume that our destiny will be one that will accommodate that desire of ours. And we have to prepare ourselves and our children for the possibility of changes. And it was this realization that was the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu, even though he made the takana, but he made it as a takanas hanavim. It was a decree not just of Moshe Rabbeinu, but it was to be seen as a decree of the prophets of the generations, because Moshe Rabbeinu knew that the circumstances very often change. And while the Torah will always remain the same, the way we give over Torah might be necessary to change from generation to generation, from community to community, and from individual to individual. That is, I think, the lesson of the nature of the takana of the decree regarding Kriyas HaTorah.
Okay, any questions in the chat, please? Thank you, Moshe. Shikoach.
Thank you.
Robert Seidenberg says, great cheer.
Okay, with that. Appreciate it, but any questions?
That isn't it. Okay, looks like there are no questions. Let me stop. I'm going to pause the recording 1 second.